I arranged for my parents to enjoy a luxurious getaway, but they opted to take my sister instead. After they left, I cancelled all the reservations. I had planned an extravagant trip to Europe for my parents and me, and when I picked them up for the airport, they dropped a bombshell: they had chosen to travel with my unemployed sister, Mia, instead of me. My mother beamed, saying Mia needed a break, so we decided to take her. I was at a loss for words. When they arrived in Europe, my mother greeted me with a cheerful "You're late," as she stepped out onto the porch, dragging her suitcase behind her. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. It was 6:02 a.m., just 2 minutes late. "Mom," I replied, forcing a smile. I got out of the car to help with their bags, only to see Mia emerge from the house, suitcase in hand. My smile faltered. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My mother turned to me, her expression far too cheerful for the situation. "Oh, Ava, we decided Mia should come instead of you. She's been so stressed lately and really needs this trip." My heart sank. "Instead of me, Mom? I've been planning this for years. I paid for everything." I felt a tightness in my chest as I spoke. She waved her hand dismissively, as if my feelings were trivial. "We appreciate it, sweetheart, but you work so hard. You can take another trip later. Mia needs this right now." Mia didn't even pretend to feel guilty. She just smirked and shifted her weight, saying, "Thanks for understanding, sis," her voice dripping with insincerity. I looked at them, my heart racing. My father came out a moment later, avoiding my gaze as he handed me his suitcase. "This is unbelievable," I said, my voice trembling. "This was supposed to be our trip, something for me to share with you." "It still is," my mother replied with a smile, "just with Mia instead. Don't make this a big deal, Ava. Your sister really needs a break." My name is Ava, and I had been working extra hours for the past 2 years to give my parents an unforgettable vacation: flights, luxury hotels, guided tours. I had meticulously organized every detail, right down to the last dinner reservation. But as I stood in my parents' driveway, watching my sister climb into the back seat of my car, I realized something I had been ignoring for years: no matter how hard I tried, Mia would always be their favorite. I clenched my jaw, biting back the angry words that threatened to spill out. Instead, I forced a stiff smile and opened the trunk. "Let's get going, then," I said flatly. If they wanted to prioritize her over me, that was fine. They could enjoy the trip, but I wasn't going to let them have a good time. The drive to the airport was eerily quiet, interrupted only by Mia's chatter. "Oh my gosh, Mom, did you see that TikTok about Paris? I can't wait to go shopping there. Do you think we'll have time for that, or will the tours take up the whole day?" My grip tightened on the steering wheel as I stared straight ahead, forcing myself to remain silent. My mother giggled softly. "Of course we'll have time. We'll figure it out when we get there." I bit the inside of my cheek. They didn't seem to notice that I was no longer part of that we. At one point, my father cleared his throat. "Thank you for driving us, Ava. I know this probably feels unusual." "Unusual? That's an interesting way to put it, Dad," I replied, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He didn't respond, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, perhaps regretting his words. Mia leaned forward from the back seat, her tone sharp. "You're not mad, right? I mean, this is really big of you, letting me go. I could never have afforded this on my own." I clenched my mouth and forced a tight smile. "Of course, Mia. Enjoy the trip." By the time we reached the airport drop-off zone, my patience had worn thin. My mom hugged me as I helped them unload their luggage. "Thank you for understanding, dear. This means a lot to us and to Mia," she said. I nodded stiffly. "Sure, Mom." Mia smiled as she wheeled her bag toward the entrance. "Thanks, Ava. You're the best." I stood there, watching them disappear into the terminal, my chest tight with anger and hurt. The ride back home was a blur, and I replayed the conversation in my head. The phone rang again, this time with a call from Mia, and I let it ring until she left a voicemail. "Ava, this is so petty," she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "We're stuck here because of you. You need to contact the hotel immediately and fix this." I rolled my eyes and deleted the voicemail without listening to the rest. I had been their fixer for years, smoothing over every mistake and picking up the slack, but not anymore. Eventually, I decided to respond, if only to stop the flood of calls. My mother's voice hit me like a tidal wave of anger as soon as I picked up. "Ava, what have you done? The hotel claims the reservation was cancelled, and none of the trips are scheduled anymore." I let her yell for a bit before calmly responding, "I cancelled them." After a long, startled silence, she yelled, "Why would you do that?" "Oh, I don't know," I replied, my tone laced with sarcasm. "Maybe because you chose to take Mia on my trip?" "You're lucky I drove you to the airport," she snapped. "Understand what?" I asked, my voice rising. "Those years of saving and preparing were irrelevant because Mia needed a break? Did you think my efforts were in vain?" "Guess what, Mom, I don't understand, and I don't want to." I hung up before she could react and switched off my phone, tossing it onto the couch. The calm that followed was beautiful, and I felt like I could breathe again. If they wanted to prioritize Mia, fine, but they could figure out the rest of the journey without me. The peace lasted barely a day. The next morning, my phone buzzed with calls and messages, which I initially ignored. I spent the day cleaning the house and catching up on work, but curiosity got the best of me. By evening, I opened my phone and braced myself for the storm of texts from my mother. "Ava, you've gone too far. Your sister is in tears, your father is upset, and we can't get into any of the hotels you booked. You're acting like a child, and I don't see why you're making this such a huge issue. Just fix it already." Finally, from my father, "We need to discuss this. This isn't right." I set the phone down, shaking my head. For years, I had been the one to fix things, to ensure everyone was comfortable and happy, and now that I had taken a step back, they didn't know what to do. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table, letting the anger simmer. How dare they expect me to clean up their mess? How dare they act as if I was the one in the wrong? Minutes later, the next call arrived, and this time I answered. "Ava," my mother said before I could respond, "this isn't funny anymore. We are stranded. Do you know how embarrassing this is?" "Embarrassing? Do you think this is embarrassing? Try saving for years, organizing every detail, and then being told you aren't even going on the trip you paid for." "Stop being dramatic," she said. "Mia needed this more than you. And now she can figure it out," I stated firmly. "You made your decision, Mom. You wanted to take Mia instead of me. That's great, but don't expect me to pay for her vacation. We're family," she said. "We don't do this to each other." I let out a bitter laugh. "Funny, I was just thinking the same thing." Mia's voice rang out in the background, crying, "Mom, just hang up on her. She's being impossible." That was the last straw. "Enjoy your trip," I said, my tone frigid. "Oh, you can't, because it isn't your trip. That was mine, and now it belongs to nobody. Goodbye." I hung up before she could respond and turned off my phone. For the rest of the evening, I felt an odd mix of anger and relief, angry that they'd put me in this situation, but relieved that I had finally stood up for myself. They could call me dramatic all they wanted, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let them take advantage of me. The following few days were blissfully quiet with my phone turned off. I finally had space to think clearly, free of the barrage of guilt trips and accusations. I spent my mornings sipping coffee on my back porch, enjoying the calm I had craved for so long. My afternoons were filled with work and catching up on little projects I had been putting off, things that reminded me how capable I was when I wasn't bogged down by their endless demands. I didn't respond because I wasn't prepared to talk, and honestly, I didn't know if I ever would be. This wasn't a one-time error, it was the culmination of years of them putting Mia first and expecting me to accept it with a smile. As the hours passed, I reflected on all the times I had been overlooked or dismissed, every holiday where Mia's whims dictated the plans, every family gathering where my accomplishments were treated as afterthoughts. This trip had been the tipping point, but the cracks had been forming for years. Grace arrived abruptly that evening, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an evident air of inquiry. I heard about what happened, she said, placing the coffee on the table. Your mom called me yesterday. Of course she did. My mother was always adept at enlisting sympathizers to coerce me into obedience. What did you say? I inquired, taking a sip. Grace shrugged, a sneaky smile forming on her face. I told her you were probably busy and would get back to her when you were ready. I laughed and shook my head. You're the best. No, you're the best, she continued, her tone becoming more serious. Because you finally stood up for yourself. I understand how difficult that is, Ava. Don't let them drag you back down. Her words stayed with me long after she departed. Grace was right, I had spent far too long bending over backward to please people who didn't seem to care about my efforts. It was time to halt that cycle once and for all. By the weekend, I had a strange sense of clarity. The anger was still simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined by something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Freedom from their endless expectations, freedom from being the family's fixer, freedom to finally live on my own terms. But as expected, the silence didn't last long. It was Sunday afternoon when I received a phone call from my father, which I decided to answer. Ava, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Your mother wanted me to call. She believes you will listen to me. Go on, I murmured, reclining back in my chair. He sighed. Look, things have gotten out of hand. Your mother is outraged, Mia is upset, and everything is simply a mess. But you are better than this. I stiffened, his words eliciting a new wave of rage. Better than what, Dad? Stand up for myself? I refuse to let you walk all over me again. That's not what I meant, he answered hurriedly. It's just that you've always been the sensible one, the one who keeps everything together. This is not like you. I let out a short, bitter laugh. You're correct, I'm not leaning over backward to clean up your mess, which is unusual for me. He hesitated, and I thought he might finally understand my point of view. But then he replied, You're punishing the entire family for one decision. Is that actually fair? Fair? I repeated, my voice rising. You want to talk about fairness? Was it fair that you and Mom thought I wasn't significant enough to join the trip I had planned? Was it right that you replaced me with Mia? If I didn't matter. That's not what we were trying to do, he added defensively. We just thought Mia needed it more. Of course you did. I yelled. You always believe she requires more attention, more support, more of everything. And I am always asked to make sacrifices for her. Not anymore. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening, and he eventually muttered, I don't know what you want me to say. I don't need you to say anything, I said, my voice firm. I just need you to understand that I'm tired of being an afterthought. From now on, I'll come first. Goodbye, Dad. I ended the call and set the phone down, my hands trembling. For the rest of the day, I allowed myself to feel everything: anger, sadness, relief. It wasn't easy, but it felt like the beginning of something new. I wasn't the family's fixer anymore, and I wasn't going to be. They could figure out how to clean up their own messes. When my parents and Mia returned, I was waiting for them in the driveway, sipping coffee and feeling remarkably calm as I watched their cab arrive. Mia was the first to comment as they stepped out, dragging their luggage behind them, their expressions filled with fatigue and displeasure. Well, I hope you're happy, Ava. I arched an eyebrow and remained seated on the porch swing. Happy about what? For too long, I've been the responsible one, I said, my voice steady but forceful. The one who fixes things, prepares everything, and ensures everything runs smoothly. And you spent just as long taking it all for granted. That's not fair, my mother began, but I intervened by raising a hand. No, Mom. What's unfair is the way you treated me. You chose Mia above me, like you usually do. So I decided to stop being your doormat. You didn't want me on the trip? Fine. But you don't get to reap the benefits of my hard work without me. I grabbed my bag from the porch swing and turned to leave. I'm glad you're safe, but don't expect things to return to normal. I'm finished. As I walked to my car, I heard them calling after me, their voices a mix of anger and guilt, but I didn't look back. The drive home from my parents' house felt strangely peaceful. For years, every visit had left me emotionally drained, but this time I felt lighter. I had finally said everything I'd been holding in, and for once, I wasn't concerned about their reaction. When I got home, I made a cup of tea and sat on the couch, replaying the confrontation in my head. They had been so sure I'd fold, that I'd given like always. But watching their stunned faces as I walked away was a reminder of how much I had changed. It didn't matter if they were angry, hurt, or embarrassed, I was done living my life to meet their expectations. The next day, Grace called me. "How did it go?" she inquired, not bothering with pleasantries. I laughed, leaning back against the kitchen counter. "Just as you'd expect. They're outraged, Mia is pouting, and Mom is probably trying to guilt me back into line." Grace snorted. "Let her try. You have a backbone now, and I'm here to keep it in place." I smiled, appreciative of her unfailing support. "Thank you, Grace. I mean it. You've been my rock throughout this." "Anytime," she responded, her voice softening. "So what's next for you now that you're no longer the family fixer?" That question had been swirling in my head since the confrontation. What was next? For years, so much of my energy had been spent trying to satisfy my family and earn their approval. But now that I had let go of that burden, the choices felt endless and a little terrifying. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I feel like I get to make the decision, not them, nor anyone else. Just me." "Sounds like the start of something amazing," Grace commented, her voice bright with a smile. Over the next few weeks, I started making small changes that felt significant in their own way. I redecorated my living room, swapping out my parents' hand-me-down furniture for pieces that felt uniquely mine. I spent weekends exploring local cafes and parks, things I had always wanted to do but never made time for. I even started journaling, writing down my thoughts and dreams without filtering them through the lens of what others might think. Each small step felt liberating. I hadn't realized how much of myself I had lost until I sat down one evening and opened the spreadsheet I had used to plan the trip. The canceled reservation stared back at me, but instead of feeling a pang of regret, I felt a surge of determination. That money had been meant for a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I wasn't going to let it go to waste. I closed the spreadsheet and opened a new browser tab, typing "solo travel ideas." A few weeks after my parents returned, I booked a solo trip to Italy. It wasn't the same itinerary I had planned for them, and it wasn't about proving a point anymore. This was for me a chance to celebrate my independence and finally prioritize myself. I had never traveled alone before, but as soon as I stepped out of the airport and into the bustling city, I knew I had made the right decision. I spent my days wandering cobblestone streets, marveling at ancient ruins, and indulging in meals at charming little cafes. Each moment felt like a gift, a reminder that I was capable of creating my own happiness. As I explored, I felt a sense of freedom I had never experienced before. I was no longer defined by my family's expectations or the role I had played for so long. I was simply Ava, a woman discovering the world on her own terms. And for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. There was no schedule, no one else to consider, just me and the freedom to do whatever I wanted. One afternoon, while sitting on the Spanish steps with a gelato in hand, I pulled out the journal I had brought with me. For years, I had written about what I wanted to achieve, but those dreams were always wrapped up in making someone else happy. Now, as I wrote, the focus shifted. Learn a new language, start a small business, travel to at least 5 more countries. The list grew, each goal a reflection of the life I wanted to create, not the one I had been expected to live. On my last night in Florence, I had dinner at a small family-run restaurant overlooking the Arno River. As I watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of peace. This trip had been more than just a vacation, it was a turning point. I had spent so much of my life trying to earn my family's approval, but here, thousands of miles away, I realized something important: I didn't need it. I was enough just as I was. When I returned home, my parents tried to reach out again, this time with softer tones and carefully worded messages. "Hope you had a nice trip," one text from my mom read. "Maybe we can all talk soon." I stared at the message for a moment before setting my phone down. I wasn't ready to respond, which was fine. This time, it would be on my terms, and I felt proud as I unpacked my luggage and displayed my treasures on the shelves. A week after returning from my trip, my mother called, and this time I answered. "Hi, Ava," she said, her tone strangely soft. "How was your trip?" "It was amazing," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "That's nice to hear," she replied, hesitating as if to find the proper words. "We've been thinking a lot about what occurred. Perhaps we handled things terribly." The admission astonished me, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook just yet. "Poorly? You unexpectedly replaced me on a trip that I had planned and paid for." "Poorly is an understatement." "I know," she said. "Your dad and I didn't realize how much it would hurt you." "And what about Mia?" I asked. "Does she feel awful too, or is she still blaming me for ruining her vacation?" "She's upset," my mother said, "but I think she knows she could have handled things better." I sighed, resting against the counter. "Mom, this wasn't just about the trip. It's been years of putting her first and expecting me to make up the difference. I am not doing it anymore." "I understand," she answered after a time. "We will strive to do better. We don't want to lose you." Her comments struck a chord deep within me, but I had learned not to let guilt influence my decisions. "I'm glad to hear that," I answered, "but it will take more than words to heal this. I want to see actual effort, not just apologies." "You will," she told me. "We'll give you the space you need, but I hope you'll let us back in someday." After the call, I felt a combination of emotions: relief that they were finally admitting their behavior and skepticism about whether they'd ever change. But when I sat down with my journal that evening, I understood something important: whether or not they changed was not my duty. Over the following months, I maintained my strict boundaries, responding to their calls and texts when I felt like it but not going out of my way to solve things or smooth over tensions. Instead, I focused on creating the life I wanted. I signed up for a photography class, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time or energy for. I joined a local hiking group and even started planning my next solo trip. Each step felt like regaining another aspect of myself. One day, as I stood on my balcony watching the sunset, I realized how far I had come. I wasn't the person who went above and beyond for people who didn't respect me. Instead, I was someone who valued herself, established boundaries, and wasn't scared to stand up for what she deserved. I felt completely liberated. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.